The dust of Dusk Creek settled in layers of fine tan powder that coated everything from the warped planks of the boardwalk to the weary souls who walked them. It was a town bleached by the Wyoming sun, a place where silence was a commodity and hope was rationed. Inside the First Territorial Bank, the air hung thick with the scent of stale paper and oiled metal. Adam Rohr stood at the teller's window, his broad shoulders stooped slightly, a habit born of years spent looking down at the earth. He counted out the coins from a small leather pouch, his movements deliberate, slowed by the permanent ache in his right leg, a souvenir from a long-forgotten battle that his body refused to let him forget. He was a man carved from the harsh landscape he inhabited, his face a roadmap of hard miles and quiet sorrows. The teller, a young man named Peterson, with a nervous tick in his eye, slid a stack of banknotes under the grill. "For the new bull, Mr. Rohr." Adam nodded, once his voice a low rumble rough from disuse. That's the plan. He had no interest in small talk. The town knew him as a recluse, a man who kept to his ranch and his memories. That suited him just fine. He was turning to leave when the bat-wing doors of the bank slammed open with a crack like a rifle shot. 3 men stormed in their faces, obscured by dusty bandanas. They moved with a brutal efficiency that spoke of long practice. One vaulted over the counter, his revolver leveled at Peterson's trembling chin. Another stood guard at the door, a shotgun held ready. The third, the leader, stalked into the center of the room, his movements fluid and predatory. On the floor, the leader commanded, his voice a cold, cultured baritone that was chillingly out of place. Now, the half-dozen customers in the bank, a mix of ranchers and merchants, dropped without a word. Adam, his hand instinctively moving toward a hip that no longer carried a pistol, lowered himself slowly, the protest from his bad leg a sharp, grinding pain. He lay on the rough floorboards, and the smell of dust and fear filling his nostrils. The robbers worked quickly, stuffing banknotes into canvas sacks. It was clean, methodical, and impersonal. Until it wasn't. A young woman clutching a small child let out a terrified sob. The man guarding the door grew impatient. "Silence her," he snarled. He strode over and shoved the woman hard, sending her sprawling. The child cried out a thin, piercing wail. Something inside Adam, an old instinct buried under a decade of self-imposed solitude, broke through the surface. He didn't think. He acted. Pushing himself up, his limp pronounced and awkward, he placed himself between the robber and the woman. "Leave her be." He said the words low and steady. "She's no threat to you." The robber's eyes, cold and dark above the bandana, narrowed. "You got a death wish, old man." He swung the butt of his shotgun, but Adam, anticipating the move, turned with it, absorbing the blow on his shoulder instead of his head. The impact sent a jolt of fire down his arm, but he held his ground. From the center of the room, the leader's voice cut through the tension. "Enough, Jed." He walked toward them, his boots making a soft, menacing sound on the floor. He circled Adam, his gaze appraising, lingering on the noticeable limp. A cripple playing the hero. How quaint. Adam met his gaze, his own eyes, flat and unyielding. The leader reached out and shoved Adam backward. Off balance, Adam stumbled, his bad leg giving way. He fell hard, his head cracking against the floor with a sickening thud. The world swam in a haze of black spots and dizzying light. He was dimly aware of the leader kneeling beside him. A rough hand fumbled at his collar, and he felt a sharp tug. The fine silver chain around his neck snapped. Through the fog of pain, Adam saw the man holding the silver locket that had rested over his heart for 10 years. It was a simple oval piece, worn smooth with time, containing the only photograph he had of his late wife, Sarah. The leader flipped it open with his thumb. He stared at the faded image inside a woman with kind eyes and a smile that could gentle the wildest Mustang. The silence stretched thick and heavy. Then a sound broke it that was worse than any gunshot. A low, cold laugh devoid of humor and full of a chilling, knowing cruelty. "Well, I'll be the leader," whispered his voice laced with a venomous discovery. He pocketed the locket, his eyes locking onto Adam's. It seems this wasn't a waste of time after all. He stood gesturing to his men. "We're done here." They were gone as quickly as they had come, melting back into the sun-drenched street, leaving behind a terrified silence and the lingering echo of that terrible laugh. Adam pushed himself onto one elbow, his head pounding, a thin trickle of blood running from his temple into his hair. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow, gaping void in his chest where the locket used to be. They hadn't just stolen silver. They had stolen his last tangible piece of Sarah. They had stolen his past. And as he lay on the cold floor of the Dusk Creek bank, Adam Rohr, the man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone, knew that his long, quiet war with the world was over. A new one had just begun. Adam's ranch was a testament to his solitude. The cabin, built of sturdy pine that had weathered to a soft gray, stood alone in an endless expanse of cracked earth, where the sun baked the silence into the very stones. It was a hard land, but an honest one. It asked for everything a man had, and in return gave him just enough to see the next sunrise. For a decade, that had been enough for Adam. His life was a series of simple, repeating rituals: chopping wood, mending fences, tending the small herd of cattle that was his livelihood. The silence of the cabin was his only companion, a presence as heavy and constant as a tombstone. In the days following the robbery, that silence became an accusation. Every empty corner of the room seemed to mock him, echoing the cold finality of the gang leader's laugh. He found himself reaching for the locket that was no longer there, his fingers closing on empty air. The phantom weight of it, a fresh wound. He would work until his muscles screamed and his bad leg throbbed with a fiery pain, hoping to exhaust the turmoil in his mind. But it was no use. The ghost of his wife Sarah, once a comforting presence, now felt distant, stolen, along with her image. He'd catch himself setting 2 plates for dinner on the rough-hewn table, a habit from a lifetime ago, only to stare at the empty chair opposite him. The loneliness, a physical blow to his chest. His reputation in Dusk Creek, already that of a haunted man, solidified. When he rode in for supplies, the townsfolk gave him a wide berth. They saw the stitched gash on his temple and the new harder set to his jaw. They whispered about the robbery, about the way he'd tried to intervene. Some called it foolish, others brave. Adam heard none of it. He was a man listening for a single voice, a single clue. He'd scan the faces in the saloon, study the brands on horses tied to the hitching posts, searching for any sign of the men who had torn a hole in his life. He found nothing. They had vanished like smoke in the wind. Justice, he knew, was not something Sheriff Miller, an old man more concerned with keeping the peace than chasing shadows, could deliver. This debt was his to collect. One evening, as dusk bled purple and orange across the plains, Adam was stacking firewood against the cabin wall. The air carried a sharp, clean bite, a promise of the coming freeze. The familiar ache in his leg was a dull, rhythmic pulse, a reminder of his body's limitations. He was halfway to the door, ready to retreat into the heavy quiet of his home, when he saw it, a figure moving along the dirt road, slow and unsteady, as if each step was a final desperate effort. His hand went to the rifle leaning by the door, an old soldier's reflex. He watched, his eyes narrowed as the figure drew closer. It was a woman, her form a frail silhouette against the fading light. She came into the circle of his yard, and he saw she was barefoot, her feet bruised and raw. She was wrapped in a torn cotton dress that had been worn through months, perhaps years of hard travel. The neckline was frayed, revealing the sharp line of her collarbone, and the hem was ripped high enough to show angry scratched skin on her shins. Her long black hair was a tangled mess, a single loose braid, clinging to a semblance of order. She looked young, yet her eyes held an ancient weariness. She was Apache, that much was clear, an outsider in a land that was hostile to its own. She stopped at the bottom step of his porch and looked up at him, her breathing shallow and fast from the effort of her journey. There was no hesitation in her gaze, only a raw, desperate plea. "Hire me as your wife," she said, her voice a tremor of exhaustion and cold. Her English was broken, but the words struck him with the force of a physical blow. "I can cook, I can clean, I can bear children. I beg." Adam froze, the rifle stock suddenly heavy in his hand. He hadn't heard a plea like that since the war, when the world was burning and human dignity was a currency few could afford. His first thought was suspicion. Why here? This was a land of ghosts and forgotten men. Why his door? His second thought was a sharp, unwelcome pang of pity. He saw the violent shiver that racked her body, the blue tinge to her lips. She wouldn't last the night out here. He weighed the risks. The townsfolk already whispered about the quiet, broken man on the roar spread. Taking in an Apache woman would turn those whispers into a chorus of condemnation. It would bring trouble. But letting her walk back into the oncoming cold, into the vast, unforgiving darkness of the plains, meant her death on his conscience. And that was a weight he knew he could not bear. He stepped back from the doorway, opening it wide in a silent invitation. "Come in," he said, his voice grating in his own ears. "Get warm. Eat." She hesitated, her eyes darting past him, scanning the simple interior of the cabin table stove rifle, over the door, a cot in the corner. She seemed to be searching for a trap. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she crossed the threshold. She kept her back to the wall, a cornered animal seeking solid ground. He saw her hand shake, not just from cold, but from a deep, resonant fear. He recognized it. It was the waiting, the gut-wrenching dread of what was to come, and the silent prayer that it wouldn't be worse than what had come before. This was the inciting incident of his new life, though he didn't know it. A desperate woman had arrived at his door, and in offering her shelter without a price, Adam Rohr had unknowingly invited a future he never thought possible. Adam moved about the small cabin with a quiet purpose, his large frame seeming to fill the space. He set a tin plate of beans and day-old bread on the table and slid it toward her. "Sit," he commanded gently. She lowered herself onto the bench, slowly keeping one arm pressed across her chest in a futile attempt to cover the torn neckline of her dress. She ate without looking at him, small, careful bites at first, as if testing whether her starved stomach could handle the food. Adam stoked the fire in the cast-iron stove, the simple act of familiar comfort. He filled a tin cup with watered-down coffee steam rising in the cooling air and placed it beside her plate. He watched her from the corner of his eye. She wasn't broken. Desperate, yes, but there was an unyielding core of strength in the set of her shoulders, in the way she held her head. When she had cleaned the plate, he nodded toward the cot in the corner. "That's yours tonight. Longer if you need it. No price." Her eyes, dark and intelligent, flicked to his, searching for the hidden meaning, the inevitable cost. He kept his voice steady, his expression unreadable. "You're safe here. No one will force you." Her shoulders seemed to relax, if only by a fraction. She looked at the simple cot and then back at him. "Name is Saya," she said quietly. "Adam," he answered. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with all the questions neither of them dared to ask. Why was she here? What horrors had she fled? Could she truly trust him? The Wyoming night was growing colder, and trust, like a spring crop, would have to come slowly, if at all. Adam turned away and retrieved one of his own clean flannel shirts from a peg on the wall. He laid it on the table. "To cover yourself better." He explained his gruffness, a poor shield for his compassion. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the worn fabric for a moment, before she slipped it on over her dress. She buttoned it to her throat, the long sleeves hiding her raw arms. For the first time, he saw her breathe easier, a small measure of dignity restored. He showed her the water bucket, the latch on the door, the basin for washing. In a final deliberate gesture, he took his rifle down from its hooks over the door and leaned it in a far corner. "Habit," he said by way of explanation. "Not for you." She gave a single sharp nod, understanding the peace offering. When the fire was banked and the lamp turned low, he stretched out on his own bed facing the wall to grant her the illusion of privacy. She lay on the cot, the thin blanket pulled up to her chin, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. He listened to the sound of her breathing, waiting for it to settle, to deepen into the rhythm of sleep. When it finally did slow and steady, he felt the weight of his decision ease. He told himself this was temporary, just until she was strong enough to move on. But a deeper part of him, and the part that acutely remembered the crushing emptiness of the cabin before she arrived, knew that something fundamental had changed the moment she stepped through his door. The first trip to Dusk Creek with Saya was a calculated risk, and Adam knew it. They needed supplies, flour was low, coffee gone, and the first frost had warned him that winter was coming on fast. More than that, Saya needed boots and a proper coat. The sight of her bare feet, now bandaged with clean rags, was a constant painful reproach. He hitched the wagon in the gray light of mid-morning. Saya climbed up beside him, wearing the patched dress with his shirt layered over it. The dignity it afforded her was a thin shield against the biting wind. Without a word, Adam draped a heavy wool blanket over her knees. She accepted it with a quiet nod, her hands folding under its warmth, her gaze fixed on the endless horizon. The ride was long and silent, the only sound the rhythmic clop of the horse's hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels. Adam found himself watching the road, scanning the hills for riders. Old habits. Dusk Creek appeared as it always did, a weary cluster of weathered buildings clinging to the dusty earth. As soon as their wagon rolled down the main street, the town's quiet rhythm stuttered. Men leaning against porch posts straightened up. Women paused with their baskets, and their conversations falling to hushed whispers. The stairs followed them like a physical weight. Adam kept his gaze locked straight ahead, his jaw tight. He had lived with the town's judgment for years. Now it had a sharper, more venomous edge. He pulled the wagon up to the mercantile, set the brake, and climbed down, ignoring the sharp protest from his leg. He turned and offered his hand to Saya. She hesitated for only a second before taking it, her small, calloused hand surprisingly firm in his. As she stepped down, the wind caught the torn hem of her dress, exposing the bruised skin of her calves. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, but kept her chin held high. She would not show them her fear. Inside, the mercantile smelled of flour-cured leather and kerosene. Two cowhands were loitering by the pot-bellied stove, their faces smug and curious. Adam walked to the counter, his limp more pronounced on the uneven floorboards. He gave his list to the clerk, Mr. Henderson, a man whose face seemed permanently pinched in disapproval, and a pair of boots for her. Adam added, his voice flat. Size small. Henderson's eyes flicked to Saya, then back to Adam, a smirk playing on his thin lips. He disappeared into the back and returned with a box. Behind them, one of the cowhands spoke, his voice deliberately loud. Didn't know old Roar was keeping company now. Must get lonely out on that patch of dirt. His companion snorted with laughter. Saya stood perfectly still, her arms crossed over her chest. Adam didn't turn around. He simply shifted his weight, a subtle movement that drew the eye and met the cowhand's gaze in the reflection of the dusty window glass. His look was cold, steady, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was the look of a man who had seen far worse than two loud-mouthed boys and had survived. The laughter died in their throats. They turned back to the stove, suddenly fascinated by the patterns of rust on its surface. Henderson set the boots on the counter. Try them, Adam said to Saya. She sat on a nearby bench, slipped her feet into the plain leather boots, and laced them up. They fit. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips before vanishing. Adam added a heavy wool dress and a thick coat to his order. He paid in coin, the clink of the silver sounding unnaturally loud in the tense silence. He handed the wrapped parcel to Saya. "Yours," he said. She clutched it to her chest as if it were a shield. "Thank you." She whispered the words barely audible. As they stepped back outside, the street had not lost its audience. A woman near the livery stable whispered to another, her eyes fixed on Saya. They were outcasts, a fact now chiseled in stone. The air grew thick with a confrontation waiting to happen. As Adam helped Saya onto the wagon, the two cowhands from the store swaggered out their earlier bravado, restored by the open air and the support of their peers. "Hey now," the taller one called out, stepping forward. He reached for Saya's arm. "No need to rush off. We're friendly folk here." Before his fingers could touch her sleeve, Adam moved. He wasn't fast, his leg wouldn't allow for speed, but his motion was economical and final. He stepped between them, his body a solid wall. His voice was dangerously low. "Trouble finds you whether you're looking for it or not," he said, his eyes locking onto the cowhands. "I'd advise you not to go looking for it with me." The cowhand, emboldened by his friend, sneered. "What's a gimp like you gonna do about it?" Adam didn't answer with words. He simply held the man's gaze. In that moment, the quiet rancher disappeared, and something older, harder looked out from his eyes. It was a glimpse of the man he used to be, a man who understood violence with an intimate and terrible clarity. The cowhand saw it. He saw the promise of swift, brutal consequences, and his smirk faltered. He took a half-step back. "Come on, Billy," his friend mumbled, tugging at his sleeve. "He ain't worth it." They retreated, melting back into the crowd of onlookers. The moment was broken. Adam climbed onto the wagon's seat, took the reins, and guided the horses away from Dusk Creek, leaving the whispers and hostile stares behind them. They rode in silence, but it was a different kind of quiet. They had faced the town's hostility together, and in doing so had forged the first fragile link of a bond. They were no longer just a man and a woman under one roof. They were allies against a world that wished them ill. In the weeks that followed, a new routine settled over the ranch, woven together by shared work and unspoken understanding. Adam, driven by a restless energy he hadn't felt in years, began his quiet investigation into the robbery. He rode into Dusk Creek more often, not for supplies, but to listen. In the saloon, he'd sit in a corner, nursing a single whiskey, his ears tuned to the low hum of gossip. He learned little. The robbers had been professionals, leaving no trail. But one evening, he overheard a freighter talking about a group of riders he'd seen camped near the Sweetwater crossing a day before the robbery, mentioning their leader spoke like a damn preacher. It was a small detail, but it lodged in Adam's mind. Back at the ranch, he and Saya worked to fortify their small world against a threat that felt ever-present. They mended the corral until it was strong enough to hold back a stampede and reinforced the cabin door with a heavy iron bar. These were more than simple chores. They were acts of mutual defense, a silent acknowledgement of the danger that lay beyond their fence line. As they worked, their bond deepened. It was built not on words, but on small gestures of trust. He taught her how to handle his rifle, his large, rough hands guiding her smaller ones, as she learned to load, aim, and fire. She, in turn, showed him how to use wild herbs to create a poultice that soothed the perpetual ache in his leg, far better than any store-bought liniment. She began to talk more, her English growing more confident. She spoke of the land she came from, of the sky and the seasons, but never of the people she had lost or the violence that had driven her away. Her past was a locked room, and Adam did not press for the key. He had his own ghosts. He understood the need for closed doors. A man with ghosts does not see the living. She told him one evening, as they sat by the fire, her fingers deftly weaving a loose strand back into her braid. Her observation was so sharp, so accurate, it left him speechless. She saw him not just the quiet rancher, but the haunted man beneath. He knew he had to protect her, not just with a rifle, but with the law, however flimsy it might be. He drove them to the office of the Justice of the Peace, a weary old man named Elias Thorne. "What brings you, Roar?" Thorne asked, peering over his spectacles. "I need a paper written," Adam said, placing his hat on the desk. "States she's employed here, on wages, board, food, and freedom to move on as she chooses, clear as ink can make it." Thorne glanced at Saya, who stood tall and silent by the door, then back at Adam. "You could just marry her. Simpler. We decide." Saya spoke up, her voice clear and strong. "No one else." Thorne studied them for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "Fair enough." He scratched out the words with a squeaking pen and stamped it with his official seal. Adam folded the paper and tucked it inside his coat. It felt heavier than a mere document. It felt like a shield. As they rode home, a fragile peace settled between them. That night, for the first time, he pulled a small, dusty phonograph from a high shelf. He wound the crank, and the thin, crackling sound of a fiddle filled the room. He stood and held out his hand. Saya looked at him uncertain, then slowly placed her palm in his. They moved in a small circle between the table and the stove, a clumsy shuffling dance. It wasn't graceful, but it was theirs. As the music ended, she rested her head against his chest, and he could feel the steady beat of his own heart, a rhythm he had long thought silent. Adam's investigation led him to a dusty way station 20 miles south of Dusk Creek, a place where men with no names and dark pasts bought whiskey and exchanged whispers. He was looking for a man named Jed, one of the robbers from the bank, whose face he had glimpsed for a moment when his bandana slipped. He found him playing cards in a shadowy corner, his shotgun leaning against the wall. Adam didn't draw a weapon. He approached the table slowly, his presence a quiet, heavy weight that drew the attention of the other players. He stopped beside Jed's chair. "I have a question for you," Adam said, his voice low. Jed looked up, his eyes widening in recognition, then narrowing with malice. He reached for his shotgun, but Adam was ready. He kicked the table leg, sending cards and coins scattering, and in the same motion brought the heavy base of a whiskey bottle down on Jed's wrist. There was a sickening crack of bone. Jed howled in pain. Adam dragged the injured man outside, away from the prying eyes of the saloon. He shoved him against the rough wall of the building, his forearm pressed against Jed's throat. "The locket." Adam growled, his face inches from Jed's. "The man who took it." "Who is he?" Jed, cradling his broken wrist, spat a mouthful of blood in defiance. "Go to hell." Adam's grip tightened. "He knew me." He laughed when he saw the picture. "Why?" Pain and fear began to break through Jed's bravado. "I don't know nothing about no picture," he gasped. "His name's Kane, Silas Kane. That's all I know." The name meant nothing to Adam. "Why hit my town? Why that bank?" "It wasn't about the money." Jed choked out, his eyes wide with terror. "It was about you. Kane's been looking for you for months. Heard you did your banking in Dusk Creek. The whole thing, it was to draw you out." A cold dread washed over Adam, colder than any Wyoming winter. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was personal. It was a hunt. "Why?" Adam demanded, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Why is he hunting me?" Jed finally broke. The words spilled out in a desperate, pain-filled torrent. "His brother. You killed his brother 10 years ago down in the Panhandle. A duel," he said. over some woman, the world tilted on its axis. Adam stumbled back, his mind reeling. The duel. He remembered it with a clarity that time had not dimmed. A man named Thomas Kane. A dispute over a card game that had escalated, fueled by whiskey and pride. It had been an honorable fight, or so he had always believed. Face to face at dawn. A clean shot. He had ridden away that day thinking the matter was settled, another violent chapter in a life he was trying to leave behind. He had never imagined it would have a sequel. The robbery, the stolen locket, the chilling knowing laugh, it all snapped into a horrifyingly clear picture. Silas Kane wasn't a common outlaw. He was an avenging angel, a specter from a past Adam thought he had buried. The fight was no longer about a stolen piece of silver. It was a personal vendetta, a reckoning that had been 10 years in the making. Adam looked at the terrified man cowering before him and felt nothing. He turned and walked away, leaving Jed to his pain. He rode back to his ranch, not as a man seeking a lost memento, but as a man marked for death. The knowledge of Silas Kane's vendetta changed everything. The ranch no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a trap. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep in the dark. Adam explained it all to Saya, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, as he recounted the story of the duel. He expected to see fear in her eyes, to see her pack her few belongings and walk away from the man who had brought a death sentence to her door. Instead, she listened, her dark eyes steady and unblinking. When he finished, she simply said, "Then we fight." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Her loyalty given so freely was a gift he felt he didn't deserve. Kane did not make them wait long. His campaign of terror was not one of direct assault, but of cruel psychological warfare. He was a phantom, a whisper of violence at the edge of their lives. One morning, they awoke to find the well rope cut. Another day, one of their best calves lay dead in the pasture, a single clean bullet hole behind its ear. These were messages calculated to fray their nerves, to make them live in constant fear. The breaking point came one moonless night. Adam was jolted from a restless sleep by a smell he knew too well, the acrid stench of burning hay and dry wood. He threw on his boots and ran outside, Saya close behind him. The barn was engulfed in flames, a roaring orange inferno that painted the night sky in hellish hues. The fire consumed a decade of his hard labor. In minutes, the heat so intense it blistered the paint on the side of the cabin. They could do nothing but watch it burn, the crackle of the flames, a monstrous, triumphant laugh. As the fire began to die down, its glow revealed something tied to a fence post near the smoldering ruins. Adam walked toward it, his boots sinking into the muddy ground. It was a small leather-bound prayer book, its cover scorched by the heat. Tied to it with a piece of rawhide was a single tarnished silver spur. Adam's blood ran cold. It was his spur, the one he had lost during the duel with Thomas Kane 10 years ago. It was a relic from their shared moment of violence, a chilling promise that Silas remembered every detail of his brother's death. This was more than a warning. It was a declaration. Kane was not just going to kill him. He was going to dismantle his life piece by piece, savoring his fear before delivering the final blow. Adam knew then that he could not hide. He could not wait for the next attack. Running was not an option. Kane would hunt him to the ends of the earth, and Saya would be caught in the crossfire. He had to end this. He had to face Silas Kane, not just to protect himself and the future he was tentatively building with Saya, but to finally confront the ghosts of his past. The choice had been made for him. He would meet violence with violence. He would finish what he had started 10 years ago, one way or another. The storm broke with a fury that seemed to mirror the tempest in Adam's soul. Rain lashed down in blinding sheets, and lightning ripped across the black sky, illuminating the skeletal remains of an abandoned church on the outskirts of town. This was where Adam had told Cain to meet him. It was a place between civilization and the wilderness, a fitting stage for their final brutal act. He stood inside the wind, howling through the broken stained glass windows like a chorus of grieving spirits. Water dripped from the ceiling, pooling on the floor and echoing through the cavernous space. The only other sound was the relentless, maddening tick of a fallen clock from the bell tower, each second a hammer blow, counting down to the inevitable confrontation. Silas Cain entered not with a crash, but like a shadow detaching itself from the deeper darkness. He was no longer hiding behind a bandana. His face was handsome in a severe, angular way, but his eyes burned with a cold, righteous fire. He held Sarah's locket in his hand, letting it swing gently on its broken chain. "I knew you would come, Mr. Roar," Silas said, his cultured voice cutting through the roar of the storm. "A man's sins, like a river, always find their way back to the source. Now, this is between you and me, Cain," Adam said, his hand hovering over the pistol at his hip. "Let it end here." Silas smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. It will end. But first you need to understand the true nature of your sin. You think you fought an honorable duel? You think my brother's death was a simple matter of pride? Lightning flashed, and in the stark, momentary light, Adam saw the raw grief etched on Silas's face. This was not a man driven by greed, but by a love so profound it had twisted into a monstrous obsession. "Your wife, Sarah." Silas continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She was a beautiful woman. So beautiful, in fact, that she caught my brother's eye long before she ever met you. He loved her, and she led him on. She let him believe he had a chance, right up until she accepted your proposal." Adam's world, which had already been fractured, shattered completely. "You're lying." "Am I?" Silas took a step closer. "The night before your duel, my brother went to her. He begged her to leave with him. She refused. She told him he was a fool for believing her promises. It was her cruel words that drove him to that card game, that drove him to pick a fight with a man he knew was faster with a gun. He didn't go to that field to win Mr. Roar. He went there to die. You weren't his opponent. You were his instrument." The revelation struck Adam with the force of a physical blow. The perfect memory of his wife, the saint he had enshrined in his heart for 10 years, crumbled to dust. The duel wasn't honorable. It was a tragedy, a suicide by proxy, and Sarah. His Sarah had been the cause. She used you. Silas hissed, his grief finally boiling over into rage. "And for that you will pay." He drew his pistol with blinding speed. The church exploded with a roar of gunfire. Adam dove behind a shattered pew as a bullet splintered the wood where his head had been. The fight was on. It was a brutal, desperate dance of death among the ruins of faith. Adam's leg was a fiery anchor, slowing him, making him an easy target. Silas was quick, precise, fueled by a decade of hate. They exchanged shots, the flashes of their guns illuminating the chaos. Adam was hit, a searing pain in his side that took his breath away. He stumbled, falling behind the altar. Silas advanced, his face a mask of triumph. "Our justice," Silas said, leveling his pistol at Adam's head, "is a debt that is always paid." Adam looked up, not at the gun, but at the locket still clutched in Silas's other hand. He saw not a villain, but a man drowning in the same sea of grief that had almost claimed him. In that instant, he had a choice. He could kill this man, end the threat, and feed the cycle of violence that had consumed both their lives. Or he could do the unthinkable. With his last ounce of strength, Adam lunged forward, not at Silas, but at the bell rope that dangled from the ceiling. He threw all his weight onto it. High above, the ancient cracked bell roared to life, its dissonant clang a sound of judgment. The frayed rope snapped, and the massive bronze bell, a ton of righteous fury, plummeted downward. Silas looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had just enough time to scream before the bell crashed down, crushing him, silencing his rage and his grief forever. Adam lay on the floor bleeding and broken, the deafening silence of the church, broken only by the sound of the rain and his own ragged breathing. He had won. But in the face of the terrible, complicated truth, it felt like anything but a victory. The long ride back to the ranch was a haze of pain and rain. Adam had bound his wound with a strip torn from his shirt, but the bleeding wouldn't stop. He clung to the saddle horn, his body swaying with each step of his weary horse. The cold Wyoming rain doing little to quench the fire in his side. When he finally stumbled into the cabin, he was a ghost of a man covered in mud and blood. Saya was there in an instant. She didn't cry out or panic. Her face was a mask of calm determination. She helped him to the bed, her small frame surprisingly strong as she supported his weight. With deft, practiced hands, she cut away his shirt, assessed the wound, and began to clean it with boiled water and herbs. Her touch was gentle, but her eyes were filled with fierce intensity. As she worked, he talked. The words came out in a broken, halting flood, a confession whispered into the quiet of the storm-lashed cabin. He told her everything. About the duel, about Silas Kane, and about the terrible final revelation, the truth about Sarah. He laid the ugly, complicated story of his past, bare, expecting to see revulsion or worse, pity in Saya's eyes. He was stripping away the last of his defenses, showing her the flawed, broken man he truly was. When he finished, his voice raw and his body trembling from blood loss and emotional exhaustion, he waited for her judgment. Saya finished tying the bandage around his ribs, her movement steady and sure. She looked at him, her dark eyes holding his, and he saw no judgment there. He saw only a deep, profound understanding. She placed a hand on his cheek, her thumb gently stroking his skin. "Your ghosts are not you," she said, her voice soft but firm. "They are just stories. We will write a new one." In that moment, her simple words healed a wound far deeper than the one in his side. She was not just tending to his physical injury. She was mending his fractured soul. She accepted him, all of him, the good, the bad, and the broken pieces of his past. Their bond, forged in shared hardship and quiet companionship, was now solidified not by a perfect, idealized memory, but by a shared, honest present. He had returned to her wounded, but alive, and she had met his brokenness not with fear, but with unwavering strength. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. And for the first time in 10 years, Adam Rohr did not feel alone with his ghosts. In the aftermath of the storm, a profound quiet settled over the ranch. Adam recovered slowly, his body mending under Saya's constant care. With his physical healing came a different kind of recovery. He had faced the darkest chapter of his past and survived. The truth about Sarah, while painful, had been liberating. It had freed him from the prison of a perfect memory, allowing him to see her not as a saint, but as a flawed human being, just as he was. A week after the confrontation, he knew what he had to do. He rode out to the small windswept hill where Sarah was buried, a simple wooden cross marking the spot. The locket which he had recovered from the church felt heavy in his hand. He opened it one last time, looking at the faded photograph of her smiling face. He acknowledged it, all the love they had shared, the pain her choices had caused, the decade of grief that had defined him. Then, with a sense of finality, he dug a small hole at the base of the cross and buried the locket in the earth. It was an act of letting go, a final goodbye to the ghost that had haunted him for so long. He returned to the cabin as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the plains. Saya was waiting for him on the porch. He walked up the steps, took her hand, and together they looked out at the land and their land. It was no longer a place of lonely survival, but the foundation of their future. For the first time in years, he felt free. Seasons passed. The harsh winter gave way to a green, vibrant spring, which in turn mellowed into a golden summer. Adam and Saya were married by Justice Thorne, under the shade of a cottonwood tree with the wind and the whispering leaves as their only witnesses. Their life was simple, built on the steady rhythm of work and the deep, comfortable silence of two people who understood each other without the need for words. The cabin, once a hollow shell of a home, was now filled with the scent of baking bread and the soft murmur of their quiet conversations. One evening, late in the summer, they sat together on the porch, watching the sky blaze with the colors of sunset. The world felt peaceful, settled. Saya, who had been quiet for some time, turned to him. She took his rough, calloused hand and placed it gently on her stomach. A small but definite swell met his palm. Well, he looked at her, his breath catching in his throat. A question formed in his eyes, one he didn't dare to speak aloud. She smiled a slow, radiant smile that seemed to hold all the promise of a new dawn. "Spring," she said, her voice full of a quiet, powerful joy. Adam stared at her, then at the endless expanse of their land, and a feeling he had no name for swelled in his chest. It was more than happiness, more than peace. It was hope, solid and real and alive. He who had lived for so long expecting nothing more than the next sunrise was being given a new beginning. He wrapped his arm around his wife, pulling her close, and together they watched the first star appear in the twilight sky, a tiny, brilliant spark of light in the vast darkness.